It's 1940. Europe is already ablaze. Poland has fallen. France and Britain are at war with Germany. And every resource, every harbor, and every supply route is becoming strategically important. In the north, along the long Norwegian fjords, a quiet struggle rages for iron ore, sea lanes, and control of the North Atlantic route. What outwardly appeared to be a struggle for the fjords was in fact a key strategic maneuver intended to secure raw materials for Berlin and open the Atlantic for the Navy and Air Force. Why were Norway and Denmark targeted? Raw materials, the sea, and protecting communications. Germany needed Swedish iron ore. In winter, ice made it difficult to transport ore to Germany via the Baltic, so large volumes were shipped through the Norwegian port of Narvik, an icy but year-round outlet to the sea. Control of Narvik meant control over the flow of vital raw materials. Furthermore, control of the Norwegian coastline would give Germany strategic air and naval bases that could threaten British communications and expand the operational range of its submarines and surface fleet in the Atlantic. Finally, the Germans feared that the British, acting first, would occupy Norwegian ports and cut off supplies, so Berlin chose to preempt the enemy. Another important catalyst was the Altmark incident in a Norwegian fjord in February 1940. British sailors entered neutral Norwegian waters and freed hundreds of British prisoners. This greatly angered the Nazi leadership and further reinforced the argument that neutral Norway could fail to protect Germany's interests and that Britain was already violating the neutrality of Scandinavian countries. For Hitler, this was proof that they had to act quickly. At the same time, the British were preparing their own operation, Operation Wilfred, to mine the leads, narrow passages off the coast, to force ships carrying Swedish ore out to sea and into the control of the Royal Navy. The Minus Plan was set for April 8, 1940, but it was then that events actually got out of hand. The Germans decided to act first. Germany's plan, Operation Weserübung, quickly, simultaneously, everywhere. As early as March and early April 1940, the OKW developed a daring plan to seize Denmark in a single blow and simultaneously conduct a series of combined landings and assaults along the coast of Norway, Bergen, Trondheim, Narvik, Oslo, and other key points. The goal was not only to capture ports and airfields, but also to quickly turn the political situation, to paralyze the Norwegian government, neutralize potential British intervention, and secure logistical routes for German troops. The operation envisioned the combined use of air power, numerous landings and airborne paratroopers, surface forces, transport vessels, destroyers and cruisers, and amphibious assaults. It was essentially an amphibious campaign in the fjords, an extremely difficult task. The German command relied on the element of surprise and the fact that neutral powers would be unprepared for a large-scale invasion. Early in the morning of April 9th, Germany launched Operation Weserübung. Denmark received an ultimatum and was occupied virtually without resistance. German units landed and quickly captured key facilities, while the Danish military and leadership, assessing the balance of forces and wishing to avoid the destruction of the capital, accepted the surrender. Denmark fell in a matter of hours and became a staging ground for further operations. Its airfields and ports facilitated the transfer of troops and equipment to Norway. That same morning, landings began in Norway, simultaneously in several places. German forces carried out amphibious landings in Bergen, Trondheim, Narvik, and Oslo. In Oslo, airborne forces were also deployed, bombing and airlifting airborne groups to airfields. The goal was to seize the royal residence and government building and deprive the Norwegians of the opportunity to organize resistance and evacuate the government. A shocked Norway found itself in a situation where well-equipped German forces were simultaneously advancing rapidly on several fronts. Denmark was occupied in a matter of hours and with minimal losses. Why so easily? Firstly, Denmark is relatively small, with short borders and a comparatively weak army. Secondly, the Danish authorities made a pragmatic decision, which they believed was best for saving the country and its population, formally maintaining government institutions under German control in order to avoid brutal fighting and destruction in Copenhagen. From a practical standpoint, this was logical. The Danes avoided large-scale destruction, but lost their sovereignty for almost the entire war. The Norwegian campaign was different. Here, the Germans encountered real, albeit unequal, resistance. The Norwegians attempted to organize a defense, land troops, and hold key ports. The Germans, however, were forced to operate in narrow fjords, where naval maneuvers were limited, and the entrances to the bays were easily controlled by artillery and mines. In several places, the Germans landed troops from the sea, simultaneously landing and transporting paratroopers by air. In Oslo, a large German force attacked the airports, capturing the airfields and thereby securing the route for further crossings and landings. In Bergen and Trondheim, the Germans also acted quickly, relying on surprise and the coordinated actions of their naval and air forces. Narvik was a key point, a port on the northern coast of Norway, through which Swedish ore was shipped to Europe. The Germans captured Narvik during night and morning operations, with a detachment of German destroyers and transports stationed in the harbor. Only the northern theater became the scene of a real, protracted struggle. Famous naval battles took place here, where both sides suffered serious losses. The Battle of Narvik, sea against fleet, land against mountains. The Battle of Narvik went down in history as one of the most dramatic clashes of the early part of the war. The British fleet attempted to strike the German ships in the harbor, resulting in two major engagements. In the first battle, British destroyers attacked the German force and managed to sink several ships. It was a daring night attack in a narrow fjord. In the second battle, when a larger British force, including the battleship Warspite and a destroyer squadron, arrived in the region, the Germans were already partially stalemate due to a lack of fuel and ammunition in their destroyers. Ultimately, the British attack was successful in destroying a significant portion of the German small fleet. But even despite the Queen's naval successes, this did not result in immediate control of Narvik on land. The Germans were intensively deploying amphibious and airborne reinforcements, and their naval losses were offset by ground successes. On land, fighting raged around Narvik in the mountainous, snowy terrain, where local Norwegian units and later the Anglo-French-Polish expeditionary forces made efforts to dislodge the Germans. Ultimately, the Allies managed to temporarily regain control of Narvik, following a landing and a successful Allied ground campaign in May. But the French-British operation was curtailed in June due to events in the West, the fall of France and the need to redeploy troops. Ultimately, the Germans retained Norway. In a strategic sense, Berlin's goal was achieved. London did attempt to preempt the Germans, Plan Wilfred, a mine-laying operation, but the operation was delayed and partially executed just hours before the German invasion, removing the element of surprise and rendering the minefields less effective. Plan R4, an airborne assault in Norway, was prepared, but its implementation was muddled. Units sailed without clear coordinates. Transfers were carried out in isolated groups. Commanders changed orders en route, and there was a lack of knowledge of the coastline and local conditions. All of this, coupled with the harsh weather and northern terrain, undermined the effectiveness of the operations. Furthermore, by mid-May to early June, the situation on the Western Front had changed dramatically. Germany launched an offensive in Belgium and France, and the Allies were forced to shift resources and attention to this main front. Therefore, although the British and French achieved local successes, including the temporary liberation of Narvik, geopolitical reality forced them to curtail the campaign in Norway and evacuate their units. This decision, painful for morale, in the long term cemented German control over Norway. Operation Weserübung demonstrated several important lessons. The power of a surprise combined attack. The Germans combined air power, amphibious assaults, and airborne assaults, allowing them to capture key points before the enemy could concentrate. The risk of amphibious operations in narrow waters. Fjords are ideal traps, narrow approaches, limited fleet maneuverability, and the possibility of counterattack. This explains the heavy losses of the Kriegsmarine, especially destroyers, and the need for tight logistical support. The importance of control over resource chains. The struggle for ore from Sweden via Narvik underscores that 20th century warfare is, above all, a war of resources, oil, ore, and transport corridors. This was precisely why Germany undertook this risky operation. In the short term, Germany achieved its goals. Norway and Denmark were under Reich control. The German Navy gained deep bases in the north, and ore supplies were more secure, though Allied attacks and submarine warfare still posed problems. Norway became a staging area for operations in the Atlantic and a base for submarines and surface cruisers. Denmark became a staging area and source of supplies and transport. In the long term, the occupation of Norway brought Germany both political and military benefits, but also a burden. Possession of a long coastline required significant forces to guard it, especially as problems mounted on the front lines. For the Norwegians and Danes, this meant years of occupation, puppet regimes, resistance, and severe hardship until Germany's final surrender in 1945. The story of Norway and Denmark in 1940 exemplifies how strategic resources and sea lanes can push states to decisive and risky operations. It is a lesson in the power of surprise, the cost of intelligence and coordination errors, and how quickly neutral territory can be drawn into a global conflict. For Germany, seizing the Scandinavian coast meant gaining time and resources. For Britain, it meant a long game of disruption and attempts to regain influence. For Norway and Denmark, it meant years of resistance and reconstruction.